Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Jackie from Hub City Bookshop, and I'm here today with Michael Farris Smith and Erin Templeton. And we're really excited to talk about Michael's book, Nick. We do have signed copies at Hub City Bookshop. We're very excited about that. And we have these cute little, very awesome temporary tattoos that he sent with the signed book plates. So I'm just going to do a little introduction for both of them, and then they have a great conversation set up for us tonight. If you know of anyone who's having trouble getting online, just have them email me. I'll put my email here in the chat real quick, just in case anybody's having trouble. So a little bit about Michael Farris Smith is the author of Blackwood, The Fighter, Desperation Road, Rivers, and The Hands of Strangers. His novels have appeared on Best of the Year lists in Esquire, Southern Living, Book Riot, and numerous other outlets, and have been named Indie Next, Barnes & Noble Discover, and Amazon Best of the Month selections. He has been a finalist for the Southern Book Prize, the Gold Dagger Award in the UK, and the Grand Prix de Latrice in France. And his essays have appeared in the New York Times, The Bitter Southerner, Garden and Gun, and more. He lives in Oxford, Mississippi with his wife and 2 daughters, and we're very grateful that he came to talk to us about Nick today. Joining him is Erin Templeton, who is the Dean of the College of Humanities, Sciences, and Business, and a professor of English at Converse College, where she specializes in 20th and 21st century American literature. She loves to run. She is a crime fiction junkie, a rabid Steeler fan, a decent fantasy football manager, and can put together a respectable March Madness bracket. For a while, she was a contributing writer for the Chronicle of Higher Education blog, Profess Hacker. In her spare time, you can find her running and probably listening to an audiobook, walking her dog, feeding a cat or two, or taking a nap. She is also a member of the, when we have time, right? She is a member of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society and has welcomed numerous other members to join us today. So thank you so much, Erin. And welcome, Erin and Michael, and we're so happy to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's nice to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited for this conversation. As probably happened to you also, Michael, when January 1st hit, my inbox kind of blew up because Gatsby entered the public domain. Suddenly there's all kinds of new things that are available. I mean, in my world, that translates often to new editions of the novel, but it also opens it up to adaptations and film versions. I think there's an opera in the works, graphic novels, all kinds of reimaginings of the story. So why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about how you came to this project?
Well, I can tell you that it's nothing that I ever would have dreamed that I would have done in my writing life. I mean, I was as surprised by the book as anybody has been surprised by the book. It's just not an idea you expect to have. But I read Gatsby for the 3rd time back around, it was 2014. My second novel, Rivers, had come out like 6 or 7 months before. And I was truly just looking for something to read in the house one day, and I wanted something short. And I just grabbed Gatsby. Me and my family, me and my wife and daughters were actually planning to go to Paris that summer, spend about 4 or 5 weeks. And I'm largely impacted by the Lost Generation and all those writers. So I just thought, okay, give me the little short Fitzgerald, give myself a kind of refresher course going back to Paris and the expatriates and all that. And first couple times I read the novel, it had been 13, 14 years since I'd read it. And I got to admit, nothing really hit me about it. But this time when I read it, I guess maybe all the things that I'd been through and the time that had passed and me kind of having success as a writer myself and figuring out what all that meant, like the book really was sung to me, like on just every page, not just the language, but I felt things in Nick, and I began to notice things in Nick that I really didn't expect to find in the reading of the book, in that I felt like a great loneliness in it, and I sensed like a great isolation in it, like things that I've experienced too. I think a lot of us go through those things, but like emotionally, it really seemed to kind of resonate with things I'd felt a lot in my own life. And in particular, when I got to the end of the novel and he realizes it's his birthday, he's about to be turning 30, and he doesn't even know And it just really smacked me. Like, how do you not realize it's one, your birthday, but two, it's like a pretty big birthday.
Like, that's a big one. Yeah.
That's a big one. I'm turning, all those decade birthdays are big ones.
Mm-hmm.
And it's turning 30, and he's in what should be the prime of his life, and the only thought he has is a couple sentences later, he thinks, well, this is going to be a decade of loneliness. And that's the line probably that really gobsmacked me, because when I was 29 or 30, it's when I came back to Mississippi after living abroad for years and finally had decided I wanted to try writing. And I didn't even really know what that meant, but I knew that I had changed and that my life was going to be different. And I remember feeling that intense sense of like loneliness and uncertainty for what was coming. And, I think that's the line that led me to write Nick, because I finished the novel and I couldn't stop thinking about that and those feelings. And I kept wondering, what brought him to tell us this story the way he tells us? And it seemed to me that he had been through some things. There was a lot between the lines that he wasn't giving us. And I just really, I thought it'd be so interesting if someone were to tell his story. And like in the moment of having that thought, I thought, well, why don't you do it? I mean, and it was just it was as light bulb as that. I mean, just somebody flipped the switch and I thought, well, I don't know. Why don't you? And I pretty much immediately sat down then back in 2014 to do it. And I wrote it in secret. I didn't tell anybody I was writing it. I didn't want anybody to tell me you got to be out of your mind. I didn't want anybody to tell me it was impossible. And so for that reason, I spent 10 months working on it, and I never once checked on a copyright, realized the copyright, thought anything about a copyright. I just wrote a novel that I wanted to be writing. And then once I said, oh, by the way, agent and editor, this is what I've been doing, they were like, oh, okay. And that's when we realized, we now have to sit here for 5 years. So it's been a really strange journey. But that's the nuts and bolts of kind of how we got to this.
I mean, there's so much in what you've said that is, just resonating with me. I mean, one of them is just how the first time you read the novel, it just didn't really sink in. It didn't really, I think in another interview, you said something like, I just didn't really get it. Yeah. And I think about that a lot because, I teach American Lit, and a lot of my students will have read this book before they get to college. And on the one hand, I'm happy about that because I think as many people should read Fitzgerald as possible. But on the other hand, I'm not happy about that because I think it's too young. Like, you have to have gone through some stuff, and you have to have felt that loneliness, but you also have to really gotten your heart broken, I think, to
I agree, for
that novel to really hit you.
That's a good way to put it.
Most, I mean, not everybody.
Yeah.
But
I'm not like you. When I see it on high school reading lists, I just think there's no way that should resonate. And I think that happens a lot. You hear a lot of people say, "Oh, I hate the book because I had to read it in high school and I just didn't get it." And I'm not surprised. I mean, I think you could probably say that for a lot of books, honestly.
Yeah.
When you're 16, 17 years old, but yeah, I had the same experience that I think a lot of people have with it right out of the gate.
Well, and you commented on how Nick is, well, like most of Nick we get between the lines, and I think that's 100% true. I think especially with Gatsby, but with Fitzgerald more generally, he's such a beautiful writer that the glossiness and the beauty of his prose like really masks a deep complexity that I think you've hinted at here. That Nick is. I mean, there's something about him, I think, that makes him a great narrator, which is that he's, watching and sort of emotionally reserved and not, trying not to invest in these characters. I mean, and sometimes, at least with the title character, he kind of can't help himself. But he is kind of not quite a blank slate. But, you mentioned in another interview that we really only know a handful of things about him. Right? Like, we know that he was in the war. We know that he's from the Midwest. We know that he went to Yale. And we know that he ends up in New York at the start of the book.
Yeah. Just a few breadcrumbs, and that's the thing that excited me. Well, it was the thing that drove me to do it because I was kind of pondering him and kept thinking about it myself. And there's just a few breadcrumbs. So on the one hand, I had these things to deal with that I thought I really needed to adhere to and to stay true to the character. But on the other hand, it was in some ways like writing any other novel where there is a largely blank slate for you to work with, where it's just it becomes like any other character you might want to put on the page, which, almost like a writing exercise where someone says, okay, here's 5 things about a character. Now go write a novel about them, or go write a story about them using these kind of 5 things. And I've said this, a lot already, that writing Nick, I mean, of course it's called a prequel to The Great Gatsby, and I understand all that, and it is but to me, it was really an intense character study. It felt like for me at times. I don't know how it reads to other people, and I think probably someone with your background might see that in some ways too, but that's how it felt. Like it was just a really intense character study in which there were a lot of different things to juggle, which made it really challenging, but also made it really interesting too. And I think his unreliability as a narrator also in Gatsby was something that played into what I was trying to do also, or was able to do.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I love about the book is that, like you don't buy into the party scene and the glitz and the glamour of Gatsby. Like your Nick is really in like some of the dark parts of that time period. It's like he comes out of, he's in the war for part of this. He's in, and he goes back to Paris on leave. But it's not a fun time. Like, I mean, it's a difficult journey for him. And even when, you think it's over and the war ends and he's able to go home, he doesn't go home. He goes to New Orleans and goes on another difficult journey. And so it's not, like the roaring 20s that I think we get sort of fed, and came out. I don't know if you remember, like, but when 2020 started, before it became what it became, there was all of this talk of, like the Roaring 20s parties and Gatsby parties for New Year's Eve. There were like big parties in New York and Paris and, Asheville, North Carolina, and just all over the place. And that made me really uncomfortable because, it's just like, which part of the Gatsby parties are we talking about here? Like the really drunk people, the car accidents, like the murder. Like,
really.
Where are we going with this?
Yeah. Well, I think,
and I like that.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it's funny you say that because those were not the things that appealed to me about Gatsby, the decadence and the parties and all that. It was everything when the party's over, or everything in, when you're alone after nobody's there anymore. Those were the things that really struck me. Those senses, you get a sense of how fragile life is and just even how fragile like moments are, I think, in that book. And I think that's something we all can relate to. It's very human, I think. And it occurred to me in the process of doing all this a couple of years ago that maybe that's what makes Gatsby stretch from one generation to the next, because one generation to the next, we can relate to those feelings of belonging and trying to be aware of what's going on around us and not being able to really get a grip sometimes on things we want to get a grip on, and realizing how quickly things can evaporate. I mean, that's things we all go through. And it's probably those things that make Gatsby kind of resonate from one reader to the next, one generation to the next. It's not the parties and those things. And because of that too, we saw that in Gatsby, and part of me thought, okay, how do I address any of that stuff at all? And then I was like, no, that's what Fitzgerald did. He addressed all that. So I don't need that. My kind of idea all along was to walk Nick up to the moment when he's there. And like, you're going to turn the page and like, then he's going to get the parties, right? And I didn't really want to romanticize anything that had led him up to that moment. I thought if I was going to create a guy who I believed, in my mind, a character who had suffered some real emotional trauma, was probably very likely suffering with PTSD and shell shock and those things, and someone who is able to detach from himself and feel so isolated. What are the things both from his childhood and his teenage years and his adulthood that got him there? So yeah, it is not the party. It is the light. It is the dark, and it's some gritty things that get us there. But like I said, I just didn't want to romanticize any of it. I didn't want it to be a war novel, where you think, oh, well, that was a nice war. I mean, no, I wanted it to be like World War I was, to really try to create that experience, so that when Nick later on is having these issues that he would, anyone who goes through something like that would likely be having, that it would be very believable.
Well, and even the moments in the first part of the book that are a respite from the war are heavy moments. I mean, he has this sort of whirlwind romance, and I don't think that this is spoiling, but you can tell me to stop. But he has this wonderful romance for like a week, and then he comes back later, and it's a completely different, like same place, same person, completely different tone, completely different tenor. The relationship has fundamentally changed. And so he's scarred both by the war, but also by the not war, by beliefs that, and I thought that was just really, it was really well done in the way that you don't romanticize that part of it either. I sort of was, and I listened to the book, and the narrator I thought was wonderful. He had just such a great cadence to his voice. It sounded just really lyrical. But at one point I was just like, can we just get a bit of a break for this poor guy? He's taken it on all sides. And he just kind of, the hits just keep on coming, as they say.
Well, my mom sent me a text message. I guess she was about halfway through it, and she's like, I sure hope Nick makes it. And I said, well, Mom, spoiler alert, he does make it. You shouldn't be worried about that. He makes it.
Right. I mean, that was the one thing that I was, that I like about books like this, where there's another one. So okay. I don't have to worry about at least that. There are other things, and other characters that I still wonder about. Particularly from the New Orleans section, I'm like, wait, what happened to him? Because you don't tell us. That section is left in suspension. And here's another question that will take us in a very different direction, because at the end of the book, there's a long, well, not long, but there's a prolonged thought or meditation on Nick as a writer. And he starts writing all of these different things. How close is Nick as a writer to Michael as a writer?
Oh, wow. Just when you thought you've heard every question there is to hear about this. I don't know, man. That's a really interesting question. I kind of go back to us being about the same age when we kind of started it. And I think the reasons he's doing it, I think, is probably the reasons I did it, which is the reasons a lot of people do it, is because you're just trying to make sense of the world in some way and trying to relate to the world in some way that up until that point you haven't quite figured out how to do that, how to engage. And you're so moved by other writers or other experiences or things that have happened to you emotionally, that you feel like you have to get it out in some way, either through journal or fiction or poetry or whatever. And I think that was certainly my experience with getting started. I got to the point where I felt like if I didn't try to sit down and write, then something was going to implode inside of me, and it was going to come out maybe some other bad ways. And I think we see Nick certainly, and I'm just talking this out loud now because I honestly, God, I've never really thought about it. But I think Nick subconsciously is doing those things too. But he's trying to calm his nerves from the war, and he's trying to remember the good things, and he's trying to transform himself from one part of his life to another part of his life, which is probably the same thing I was doing at that time too. You know, I came back home to Mississippi and started writing at a time when all of my friends were. I come back to this small town where all of my friends have gotten married and had children and gotten jobs and bought houses. My parents didn't live there anymore. My sisters had moved away with their own families or whatever. And I was in this very strange, transformative place where I was an alien to them and vice versa. And I felt like, you know, me writing pushed me through that. It was me transforming from one part of my life into another. And I can see Nick doing that in the end of the book when he's sitting there. And he's alone and he's back home, which is strangely exactly what happened to me. And he's beginning to write as a way to transition from this life that he's lived to this life that he's hopefully going to live. That is a fine question, I have to say. And I would have to, I think there's certainly similarities. Yeah. I'm glad you asked that because that's
Oh, good. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great part of the book in which, you know, Nick is, like, as you say, like, he is trying to make sense of these experiences he has had. Many of them have traumatized him and scarred him and, like, left marks that are, you know, he's going to be carrying for probably the rest of his life, you know, and trying to think about what happened with this woman and how he sort of tried to find her in other people, but then also what happened in New Orleans and sort of trying out alternate endings for those characters, and like maybe it happened one way and maybe it happened another way, and maybe it was a happy ending and maybe it wasn't an unhappy ending, and you're not really sure which version would be which given the circumstances that I don't want to, you know, give away for people who haven't read it yet. But you know, I think that's a really interesting way to think about, you know, this moment of transition for him and apparently also for you as a writer. But I always like to, you know, talk to writers about their writing, you know, especially because like you've had kind of a prolific career thus far. I mean, like your books are coming out pretty quickly, one after the other. I mean, if you look at, you know, I was creeping on your Wikipedia page earlier today, and you know, there's a gap, but the gap is explained by Nick, which apparently whoever wrote that entry needs to like figure out. But you know, 2011, 2013, 2015, which becomes 2021, 2017, 2018, 2020. You know, pretty rapid succession. Is there a secret to how quickly you're able to move through stories?
I don't know if there's a secret. I do know that when I get struck by an idea or something that I want to write about, I don't need any more than just an image or just an idea. Like I mean, I could look back at every one of my novels and I can remember like the moment of inception. Like the moment of inception for Nick was me thinking, it'd be cool if somebody were to write his story. And like 3 days later, I was sitting down just writing him on a train coming back across America after the war. And I didn't need any more than that. I just began to like try to go after it. Desperation Road, I imagine, you know, a woman and a small child walking down the side of the interstate in the Mississippi heat, wondering what the hell are they doing there? And I just sat down and I just started going with them to see what it was like. And I could say, you know, with Blackwood, with the kudzu, this haunted kudzu covered valley, I thought, well, that'd be really interesting to build a town around that. So I just did. And I mean, when I have something that strikes me, I don't sit around and think about it forever. And I certainly don't feel like I need to figure out the story or a fourth of the story or anything. I just really need to be like grabbed and struck by that image or that character in that particular space and time that has raised my eyebrows. And then I do not like working on different things at the same time. Like once I start a novel, I want to see it all the way through. I don't stop and go, oh, I got an idea for another novel. Let me write 20 pages of that, or let me do this and that and the other. When I have started a novel, I've been able to like just I really stay with it and I walk with it, and I love that. I love that 8 months to 14 months or however long it takes, depending on the book, of that first draft when they're just with you every day and every night, and you can't sleep, and you see them around every corner, and they're talking to you in your head when you're eating lunch and everything. So I think that's been a big part of it is just when I kind of sign up for something, I like to see it all the way through without diverging onto another road. And because to me, that's just an excuse to procrastinate and just an excuse to not be writing, where the deal is you're supposed to be writing. And two, that really adds to the habitual nature of showing up every morning and really working. William Faulkner said, yeah, it's real important that a writer feel inspired. And fortunately, I feel inspired every morning at 9 a.m., which basically he meant I'm showing up at 9 a.m. whether I feel like it or not. And those are some lessons I've learned from writers who I admire, who had things to say like that. So I guess if, there is a trick, that would be it. Although it just doesn't sound like much of a trick, but I think I really enjoy focusing on the project at hand so that I can do it as intensely as I can possibly do it for as long as I can do it. Because I almost feel like it's this flame that's going to burn out, and you just got to keep the fire just roaring for as long as you can until, you kind of reach the end.
We're going to come back to fire in a slightly different way. But, that raises a question for me back to Nick, because it is such a historical book, set in, the basically, the 19 teens and up to 1925. How much research did you do to get those details? Just so.
Way more than I wanted to. This is why I've never written and probably will never write another historical novel again, is because the amount of homework that goes into it is really striking to me. And I don't like homework. I've never been a fan of homework. My notion of research up until this point has been, if I can't Google and find the answer in about 5 seconds, I'd either cut it out or make it up. And you can't really do that when you're writing a Lost Generation novel. I will say that a lot of the stuff, a lot of the World War I stuff, though, was really interesting to me. Like, I think we all have notions from history class or films we've seen about World War I, about kind of what it was like. But once you start really reading about what that trench warfare was like and what those people suffered and what they went through and just how horrific it was. I mean, I really remember thinking, I don't know how anybody survived this war. Like, how did not every single person get killed during this war? And then when I realized I wanted Nick to do a little something different in the war, and I found the tunnels, I thought to myself again, oh my, I had no idea that even existed. Like, that was even a job in the war. So all those things were very eye-opening for me, and I'm a curious person of nature, so it didn't necessarily feel like homework, during those moments. And I would say the same thing for New Orleans. When I knew he wasn't going to go home, I'm like, it just didn't seem realistic for me that he's going to go home at that moment. Where am I going to send him? Oh, well, I'll bring him down to New Orleans into my wheelhouse. And I started reading about New Orleans during that time period. I was like, oh my goodness. I mean, New Orleans is interesting enough, like today, right at this moment.
Right.
But in 1920, it was multiplied 10 times over by the dynamic of the things that were going on there. I think Nick's really getting his eyes opened in different parts of this novel, to Paris, to the war, to New Orleans, but that's also me getting my eyes open at the same time to those things I was learning and experiencing. But it was a lot, but I think that's my last novel to be set in 1920 or 1930 or whatever. I'm gonna probably stick to Google my 5 second Google routine.
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting to me because we got to New Orleans, and I teach a class on Fitzgerald and the Jazz Age. We have an interim session, and one of the things that we do in that class is my colleague from the School of Music comes in and does a talk about jazz. And like, why is jazz, like, why was it so scandalous? Because, you know, today we tend to think of it as like elevator music, you know, if we don't know anything about, you know, the actual tradition. And, you know, it's born in a brothel. And it was basically born from the musicians who were hired to like entertain the men as they were hanging out waiting their turn. And you don't actually, like, you don't make that connection explicit, but it's such a fundamental part of what colors Fitzgerald later on in Gatsby and in, you know, and basically all the rest of his work. But he never goes directly there. And so I love that connection that we find here. That's just a different, you know, just a different historical vantage point that's happening. But yeah, like talking about the war, the photographs that we see, you know, that come out, you know, of the trenches and, you know, from the different technological marvels, you know, chemical warfare, which, you know, ends up being another big part of this book, for one of the other characters who comes home, you know, and, you know, is not just psychologically traumatized, but is physically also never the same.
Well, you know, there's a line from A Movable Feast that had a lot to do with this novel too, and Hemingway says in A Movable Feast that we didn't trust anyone who wasn't in the war.
Yeah.
And that line had always kind of been in the back of my mind somewhere. So when I kind of had the idea for Nick, I realized that one of the very first things he and Jay talk about is they make the connection. They ask each other, "Were you in the war?" "Yeah." "Where?" And that's, you know, that immediately they have this kind of behind the eyes like camaraderie between them, because they're people who have experienced this thing that no one else can understand. You know, the only people who can understand it are the people who were there, who experienced it. And that just seemed like the perfect jumping off point for me with Nick to create the detached, isolated, I think somewhat depressed, also very kind of dreamlike and naive and unrealistic too, character that we see. Was put him in the war, and let's really show what the war was like. Let's don't give the, you know, 90-second flag waving edition of it. Let's create the trenches, and let's create the rats and the vermin and the disease and the mustard gas and the fear too. That was something that really struck me. It's like, when I'm writing Nick in the war and those other characters around him, how afraid they must have just been, and how you just have to become almost inhuman, I think, to make it from one day to the next. So yeah, I mean, that the movable feast line, and then Jay and Nick kind of making that connection right out of the gate with one another, that had a tremendous amount to do with me putting him where I put him to begin with.
Well, and it's like, what I appreciate so much about the war scenes is that there's so much nuance, and there's so much, I mean, they're brief scenes, you know, you don't spend 100 pages in a trench, but you give us just enough to tell us the depth of the trauma that he's experiencing. You know, and there's small moments. I mean, the one, you know, where he wakes up in the pile of bodies, and hears that voice, which haunts him for the rest of the novel. You know, like, it was such a small moment, and it had such a powerful impact. I think both on the character, I mean, obviously on Nick, but I think, you know, because you didn't make it a huge moment in the book, it just the ripple effect just kind of went on and on and on.
Thank
you.
That's
see that, you know, there is a moment.
That's really one of my favorite moments of the novel, and that's actually, when I have done some readings, that's the passage that I'll read, because it wasn't just him crawling out of that pit, and it's just one of those things as a writer that just happens. He starts crawling out, and I'm just kind of imagining what it's like, and then he just, all of a sudden, you hear the voice calling for help, and there's nothing I expected when that scene began, but it really resonated with me, just that added dimension of horror of what's going on, and how you would carry that with you probably forever. You know, it's kind of going to, because he couldn't have been in a more helpless situation. There was no other choice to make. But that's also one of my favorite.
Yeah. given everything that he had been through, and he's injured at that time, he's out of it, he doesn't have the luxury of stopping and waiting and planning. Like, he's got to move.
Yeah.
And it's all he can do to get himself out. But to know that there was somebody else and to not be able to do anything, it connects to the later part in the book, when he meets these other people in New Orleans. It also, I think, connects later on into Gatsby. And
I think
you
so
sort
too.
of, you wonder, like, Nick, why are you getting involved with these people? Like, they're horrible people.
Yeah.
But that's also like the New Orleans scene, like Colette and Judah, and they're also horrible people. But you have this, he has this, that moment of recognition that you talk about on the street, where he sees, is it Judah?
Judah, yeah.
Judah. They see each other and they recognize each other because they have the, it's that look that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And other people, like Colette recognizes it in Nick when she meets him. Oh, okay, you were there too.
Yeah.
And that's really,
and I think
really
that's
powerful.
something, I felt that in Gatsby too. It's like, people are like, ask me, well, what connects Nick and Gatsby? I mean, there's those sketchy details we talked about that have to, but I think it's the emotional things that when you read, you begin to make the connections with, like him feeling so helpless and having no choice, and how hard when he crawls out of that pit. We see how he holds on to this thing in Gatsby when he knows it's crumbling. He knows there's no way out, but he's holding on. He's trying. He hears these echoes in his head. And as I was reading Gatsby originally, I thought something made him this way. You don't just show up and start acting like this. And I think Nick is full of those moments to where you can see the emotional resonance later in Gatsby, where you can maybe get a better understanding of where this might have come from, the reasons he's reacting in this way. Why does he feel, this way about it? When he's so distraught, when nobody comes to Gatsby's funeral, the opening pages of Nick, it's Nick wondering if he leaves Ella there and he was to die, is anybody going to give a shit if he's dead or not? I mean, that's like early pages on. It's just kind of one of these things that, and it's nothing I made a list of things to do either. It's just as I was going back reading and kind of thinking about both of the books as I was writing it, I tried to, I don't like hitting things on top of the head with a hammer. I like kind of giving people the opportunity to put it together themselves. And there were a lot of moments like that, like the one you're talking about, the one I'm talking about, that I think, which is what I'm telling people: read Nick first and then read Gatsby. And I think that connection, some of those things will resonate more clearly or even more thoughtfully by accident or by who knows what, as the two kind of tie together on that emotional level.
So let's talk. I mean, we talked a little bit about fire, the writing of the fire, but fire is also a really important plot point in the book, both in the war, and then that's really what galvanizes the whole New Orleans section, is another fire. And I'm going to bring us to the cover of your book, which also has a really great flame motif down there, which I didn't, at first I just didn't look too closely at the cover. I saw, it's the blue and the eyes, and of course that's a hearkening to the Gatsby cover. And I think we have yes. So here we are. I found this screenshot, or I took this screenshot earlier today, which has both of your cover and the Gatsby cover. And so I guess the question is, how much how much say did you have, or do you have, in the covers of your books as a writer?
Sometimes I have more say than usual. Well, what I've come to realize is when they send you a cover and they send you about 1,500 words as to why they love it so much, they've already had some real serious discussions about it. I had no idea what to expect with Nick. Like with other novels, typically what you do is they'll ask you, what are some other book covers who you think like might live in the ballpark? What were, and we kind of give some comps, and there's 6 or 8 comps, and okay, then the graphic designer goes off and does their thing and whatever. There was never that conversation with Nick, so I truly had no idea. To hear my editor tell it, I've been fortunate too. I've had the same graphic designer for each of my last 4 novels with Little Brand. I think his name is Greg Cullup, and I think he does an incredible job, because the Blackwood cover too just absolutely blew me away. Yeah. I didn't need to see anything when they showed me that. I didn't need to see anything else. I'm like, of course. But essentially, he told. I'm sorry, my Mac's about to fall asleep. I'm trying to find my table. Essentially, he told him, look, Michael's written a bold book. We're getting behind this in a bold way. We want a bold cover. And then he sends us that cover with those eyes and the blue and the fire. And my jaw kind of dropped. I'm like, if we're going to do it, we might as well go all the way, because there's a clear nod to the original cover. But there's also Nick's eyes, which are different than the eyes. And they're like, to me, when I saw them, I'm like, that's wide awake, war-torn, trying to survive emotionally eyes. And it just really knocked me out. And I was like, there'll be no mistaking who this is about. And I love the touch of fire at the bottom, because, like you said, there's both the fire of the battlefield, but also the things that happen in New Orleans. Hold on, I got to plug in.
Okay, no worries. No, I mean, and I thought about that, when I first saw the cover, I just thought, okay, well, I see what they're doing, and it's a nod to the Gatsby cover. And then I looked at it again, and I looked more closely, and I really thought, oh, and then I looked to see, okay, well, who did this? And I saw that it was the same person who did. And I will say, I have not yet read Blackwood. I bought it during the pandemic. From Hub City, there's my little Hub City. But then I sort of realized I can't read just anything remotely dystopian during the pandemic, because it was just, But I loved it. But I bought it because I loved the cover so much. I just thought it's such a cool image. And I read the little flap, and I just said, okay, well, this is good. And, maybe then Andrew will leave me alone because I'll finally read a Michael Farris Smith novel. And I recognized it was the same person. And so I thought, okay, how much control, because I know some publishers are just like, here it is. And other publishers, it's a much more collaborative relationship. Oh, wow.
I was more excited to be, I was more, I won't say happy or unhappy, but I was more agreeable to just kind of leave it wide open with Nick, because I was so exhausted from the book and from the wait, and I was like, I have no doubt they're going to do a killer job. And I was just and I had no real idea what to expect either. So I think it really almost shocked me in a way, which was, I'm like, okay, if it shocks me, then I think when people walk past it or see it, they're going to go, oh, okay, let at least turn their attention toward it as well, which is really what you want. And I thought it clearly sung to what the book is trying to do or what it's about.
So you guys have been amazing. I love this conversation, every bit of it. I was actually a little bit distracted, and but I just realized the time. So I wanted to see if you would mind if we checked in with audience questions.
Yeah.
Sure.
Did that screen share work okay, Erin?
It did, yes.
Okay.
At least it did on my end. Hopefully it worked for everybody else.
We have this is the first time I've used screen share on Crowdcast, so thanks for being patient with that. Loved that picture though.
Yeah, it's helpful to see them both next to each other.
Yeah. We have a few questions from the audience, and they are multi-part questions. So I wanted to try to get to those if you guys are okay with that.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we have one from Alma. I enjoyed your book, thank you. I'm wondering about the storyline with Nick's relationship with Ella. I loved how you wrote about his longing and obsession. Did you create that story to explain why Nick might sympathize with Gatsby and Daisy's relationship? Were you trying to create a parallel to the Gatsby-Daisy story in terms of longing?
Oh, hi. Thank you for the question. It's a very good question, and you were right on the money with kind of what I was thinking about it with. the thing that struck me about Nick in thinking about writing this novel was like, he so easily goes down that road with Jay and this dreamlike world and this idealistic thing that he and Daisy are trying to create. He's a welcoming party to it. He never argues. He does exactly what they ask him to do. It's almost like he can imagine them creating this miracle as well. And I thought, for someone to so easily go along with something like that, they have too probably have also had to have the experience of being on the edge of something that was really beautiful and really potential, only to have it removed from them. Because how else can you kind of be a romantic if you haven't had a romantic episode, or if you haven't, like Erin said earlier, had your heart broken? Like, how can you understand heartbreak, and how can you be empathetic toward it, and how can you be energetic even and toward trying to help someone else mend if you haven't had that same experience also? So I don't know that's how Ella began with me in the novel, but as I began to write and move along, that's the role she really began to fill to me. And that's kind of how I knew it was going to end in some way other than, walking down Paris holding flowers with the sun shining and, birds singing type thing. But yeah, that's a really great question too. It was an opportunity to show why Nick is able to be the spirit he is between Jay and Daisy, because he's had those moments himself to where he was right there, but things that may have been things even out of his control is what moved him away from it.
Well, and it's like the same thing with Colette and Judah too, right? Like he sees the two of them and their relationship, and like they're that they were what they were before the war and what they are after the war. Is tries to sort of mediate, and may or may not have been successful. We don't know at the end how that plays out, but the echoes there I think are really interesting.
Thank you. I have another question. I'm going to skip one because I want to make sure we get at least one from everybody. Stephen asked, do you think that on a fall, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, were a natural evolution of the social political changes of the preceding decades, or more driven by reaction to the catastrophic war, disjointed economies, and favorable exchange rates? Thank you for sharing, Nick, with us.
Oh man, this sounds like another panel discussion for another day.
Yeah, that's a big question.
Just as much as you feel comfortable with, because there's a few more questions too, so no pressure.
Well, I'll just say this in brief, that when I sat down to revise Nick in 2019, after it's sitting there for 4 years, because of the things that have been going on in our country, socially, economically, racially, I keep going, but I'm not. All right. I was really shocked at how parallel 1919 felt to 2019. Like the things in Nick, I was right. Nick's coming home to a country that is at the edge of a great transformation through 4 years of just crippling heartbreak with the war, through just every day being a struggle. It was, a country in a great sense of transition. There was a new divide between rich and poor. There was feelings of distrust and doubt among our institutions and between people and everything. And it felt, when I was reading, my editor and I both had the same thing to say, like how strangely contemporary Nick felt being published now. Parallels 100 years apart. And if it would have been published in 16, without the copyright thing, that all would have been lost. So I think in some strange way it felt, and I've heard people say this, it feels like a weirdly contemporary novel where you've almost got these this frame of America 100 years apart, and they don't really seem to be that different, which is, again, there was no intent in that whatsoever. Maybe that just does speak to the cycle we tend to be in this country. Over and over.
Well, the way that you talk about prohibition at various points in the book, and there's a character, not one of the main ones, who's like, can you believe that this is going to happen, and that they're going to come home and they're not going to be able to have a drink, and these sorts of things. And it's a different debate than the debates we've been having on a national level of late, but the same kind of vitriol in that conversation that we see amongst some of those characters. Okay. We can see that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for opening up about that for us. I know that wasn't an easy question, but it was a good question, so I'm glad we answered it.
Very good question.
So there's another one from, I believe this is, Brian. He says, Michael, I love Gatsby. I had often wondered where Nick had come from, and your book has answered that. But what do you think happened to Nick in the end post Gatsby? If you're not going to write another historical novel, might you hazard a guess as to Nick's ultimate fate?
That's a really good question. And I'll tell you, I had not once thought about what happens to Nick after Gatsby until about 3 months ago. I was talking to someone about it who was just kind of thinking about it in terms of like television, like if this were to be a television series. Well, and the question came out, well, what do you think happens to Nick after Gatsby? And I've spent so much time thinking about what happened to Nick before Gatsby. I'll admit, like it had never crossed my mind. But hearing that question again now, it's like I don't know. I mean, I like to think he was out there trying, and maybe one day got married, and maybe one day had kids. But I picture Nick wherever he is and wherever he went, whatever happened to him, probably staring out of the window a lot. Hopefully, able to have real life relationships, and hopefully in a great state of recovery too. Like people ask me, like, did I think Nick was hopeful? And I said, well, I think it's hopeful in ways, but I said to me it's very much about recovery. Like Nick seems to be in stages of recovery as we go through, and I think life in general is about recovering from one thing to the next in a lot of ways. And so, hopefully Nick is taking all the things he's learned after Gatsby or experience, and he's in some great state of recovery somewhere where he can have his own as normal as it can possibly be life. But I have no idea. It's a big thought.
Interesting. The most recent movie puts him in therapy, right? Like sends him up to Minneapolis and puts him in a sanatorium where he's talking to a psychiatrist. And I actually really like the most recent movie, except for that frame. But that's a whole other conversation that we don't have time for. But as long as as long as we don't go that route, I think, the question that I have about this, and I don't, you don't have to answer it, but like, does he go back to work in the store? Because he goes to Long Island to get out of his dad's store. Does he goes back to the Midwest at the end of Gatsby? But does he go back all the way to his parents' Midwest, or does he go to a different Midwest?
There's part of me that feels like Nick just gives up. That he does go back, and he just goes into this almost zombie-like world of the picket fence Midwest, where he can live and he can exist without much problem at all, with almost no effort, and he just kind of gives up, and just the next 30, 40 years of his life go by, and that's kind of it. And then there's another part of me that thinks he gets back home, he catches his breath, and he realizes I know what it's like to live, and this is not living, and there's got to be something somewhere else for me. And and I mean, I don't know. I mean, I like to think that spirit is in him. I kind of don't like the idea of him kind of mindlessly walking through the next 30, 40 years.
Right.
I
like
the
him
idea
to
of
go
him
back and like find those books where he took, like with all the writing that he did before he went to New York, to open up those books and do something with all of that writing. I think that's my ideal ending.
Or maybe, hopefully, he goes back to France and looks for Ella again. Whether he's going to find her or not, it's a different story. But I think that spirit of saying, I'm not going to let this die, I could see the possibility in that also.
That gave me chills. I love that. So I wanted to also just give you a chance. You told us a little bit about, I'm going to swing the subject a little bit since we're almost done. We were talking about a movie that you have coming out based on your book, The Fighter. Yes. And I wanted to make sure you got a chance to tell us a little bit about that before you finished.
So The Fighter, which came out before Blackwood, I believe that was in 2018, is called Rumble Through the Dark. It's screen name, but I wrote the script, and we began filming in Mississippi in about 5 weeks, actually. Erin Eckhart is playing the lead, and we are in the process of filling out the rest of the cast, and everybody's pulling into Mississippi as we speak, and we're making a movie in August, which will be out next year, but I'm really excited about it. One of the producers is Cassian Elwes, who produced movies like Dallas Buyers Club and Mudbound and Monsters Ball, so the sensibility is very much there. And then the directors are brothers Parker and Graham Phillips. They had their first feature come out last year. It's called The Bygone. They're a very talented couple guys, and we all felt, aesthetically and creatively, we were all on the same page, and the script is, I'm very happy with it. I think it's going to come across great on the screen and really portray the story the way it needs to be portrayed. But yeah, I'm super excited, packing my bag and heading down to the locations here in about a week or so, and really excited to see how it's going to go.
That's excellent.
We're really excited for you. I hope it does really well, and I'm really glad also that you wrote the script for it, because I love it when the authors have part of the production like that.
Yeah, it helps.
Usually, it always turns out better.
Yeah, these movie people, they need all the help they can get. I tell them that, but they do.
Just a little bit. So, I had a really good time listening to you guys. Is there, and Erin's posted a link for more about the Fitzgerald Society and some of the events that they have, if anybody wants to check that out. I put a couple of links.
I just wanted to really quickly mention that I know there's a couple teachers that are watching us this evening, and there are a couple of sessions on teaching Gatsby, both in the United States and outside, like in the rest of the world. And the link is in the chat for a bunch of different Fitzgerald conversations that will be happening, open to anyone who wants to come. You don't have to be a society member. They're free, different times, different days, to try to meet with different people's schedules with work and childcare and that kind of stuff. But if you're interested, visit that link and you can register for a whole bunch of different webinars.
Very cool. And of course, don't forget to support Michael and buy his book. We have signed copies in the shop. It's gorgeous. Thank you, Erin.
Yeah, wait.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, she's got a book plate in there. Look at that.
I do, yeah.
Nice.
I love it. So there's a button down below if you want to go look at it now, and it's also on Hub City's website. And we hope that you'll support him and read this awesome book. So thank you guys again for spending time with us this evening, for everyone who came, and for Michael and Erin for a really, really fun conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed it. And Hub City is one of my favorite bookstores, so I really had a good time doing this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Until next time, hopefully we'll get to see you for another book soon.
Super. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you, Michael.
Good night, all.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you again.
Good night.
Bye.